Well, joining me now from Paris is Denis Macshane. He's the UK's former Minister for Europe and also the author of the book, Brexit, No Exit, How in the End Britain Won't Leave Europe. Lee Jones is in London. He's an Associate Professor in International Politics at Queen Mary University. And Simon Usherwood joins me from Guildford. He's the Deputy Director of the academic think tank UK in a Changing Europe. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Denis Macshane, it's been about 2.5 years since we last spoke. We spoke on the morning after the vote on the banks of the Thames. You were against Brexit. I mean, no matter where you stand, I guess on both sides of this, I think everybody can conclude that this government has really made a big mess of this 2.5 years down the line. Is it becoming an embarrassment now?
It is, to be honest. As we speak, the fanatical anti-European Conservative MPs are organising their attempt at a putsch against Mrs May. They're having a vote of confidence in her in the House of Commons. It finishes in a few hours' time. She'll win it, but she'll be badly wounded, like she was badly wounded on Monday when, having told everybody there was going to be a vote yesterday, she had to pull it and run off to embarrassing meetings with Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker. It's a complete and utter mess. I defer to my two distinguished British colleagues, but it's nothing like this has been seen in my lifetime. I'd say in the last 100 years, you probably have to go back a couple of centuries to see complete and utter chaos, incoherence. The economic damage to the country is beyond belief, and we haven't even got to Brexit yet.
Right. So Lee Jones, to be fair to her, and yes, it seems as if she will survive that no confidence vote because far more MPs than needed have already come out publicly and said they will back her. It's 170 plus and she needs 158, right? To be fair to her, during this time, all she's trying to do is get the best deal possible for the United Kingdom. And the hardline Brexiteers are saying, no, 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 you have to show more sovereignty, more firmness against Europe. They're being unreasonable, aren't they?
At this late stage, you really have three choices. You either endorse the deal that she's put on the table, which I think is highly problematic, or you stay in the European Union, cancel Brexit altogether, which I think would be disastrous democratically, or you prepare for an exit without a withdrawal agreement. Those are the choices. There's no more time left to go back to Europe to renegotiate. The EU has said it will not make any concessions on the crucial issue of the Irish border backstop. And so it's fantasy politics at this stage to think that you can just swap out Theresa May for somebody else who will magically be able to turn the situation around in Brussels.
Simon Usherwood, we heard from Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, saying no room whatsoever to renegotiate the deal. Is the EU right to be playing hardball?
I'm not so sure it's about playing hardball. It's much more about where the EU is and the interests that it has. It's been very clear what its position has been since the start of this process. And it's stayed resolute on that. So, again, I think part of it is also a recognition that the UK doesn't have a strong position in all of this, that if it can't reach an agreement, either on Theresa May's deal or some other deal, as Lee says, that isn't going to happen, then the UK ends up tumbling out next March without any arrangements in place. And that will hurt the UK a lot more than the EU. So it's not so much about being unwilling or unable. It's just a reflection of the situation. The EU would like this to be resolved in a negotiated and measured way. The problem for the UK is that there's nobody in Parliament right now who has a clear majority for the path that they want to have.
And Denis Macshane, for those who want a fantastic deal with the EU, is it a bit like saying, I want to divorce you, but I want to continue to have sex with you? Is that what they're telling the European Union?
Well, in effect, yes. It actually is more simple than that. The European Union is a community of laws. It's based on laws, not political agreements, but legally enforceable laws. Britain chooses to leave the marriage bed or the golf club, or choose whatever metaphor you like, but then still wants to have get in under the sheets again on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, or come and play golf on Sundays, Thursdays and Saturdays. And the European Union says, sorry, you've left. I mean, you can't quite do that. oh, we'd like to, well, but that's against the rules. And so that's the problem of cake and eat it. But there are other ways out of this, you know. I mean, this is an enormous constitutional political government crisis. It's like a giant tube of super glue that's been squeezed into every crook and nanny of government and politics, and everything is seized up. Now, a way out of this, and we've got an example today, 30 months ago, Tory MPs chose Mrs May as their leader, and now they want a second bite at the cherry, so they're having a second vote. Well, 30 months ago, on the basis of a campaign many people think was dishonest and fraudulent and financed illegally, we chose to leave Europe. So why don't we, like Tory MPs, have the right to have a second vote on leaving the EU? That's one possibility. Another is a general election, but that would require a very big vote in the House of Commons. There are possibilities, but don't look to Europe to rip up its rule book just to suit Rupert Murdoch and the Europe. People have been campaigning for 25 years against Europe. This is a big ideological project in Britain. And I respect the guys who do it. They're entitled to it. They thought they'd won, but it's now turning into a complete and utter disaster and incredibly dangerous and damaging to the country. So perhaps Britain will have to think again.
Lee Jones, Denis Macshane wants a people's vote. Would you accept that?
No, I wouldn't. I think it would be pretty disastrous for democracy. I mean, Denis is right in the sense that the problems lie in Britain. The problems don't lie in Europe. You know, Europe has its interests and rules. And the problem is the British political establishment never came up with a unifying vision to take the country out of the European Union. In fact, the British political establishment is firmly pro-EU. Something like 3/4 of parliamentarians voted to remain. So they're very out of kilter with the majority of the population. And they've never really accepted the legitimacy of the vote, a lot of them, and have been plotting from the very beginning. And even the Conservatives that said, OK, we accept the instruction, let's get out of the European Union. At the very beginning, they've tried to pursue a deal that disrupts the status quo as little as possible. And the political elite is unified in that, if nothing else. To hold a second referendum at this stage would be to say to the British population, you cannot issue binding instructions to the political elite.
But Lee, I mean, this is 30 months ago, as Denis said, right? It's 30 months ago, so things change, realities change. Have a second bite at the cherry. What, are we going to be bound by this forever and ever?
What has changed is not what the European Union is, or Britain's position in it. That has not changed. What has been demonstrated is the British political establishment's unwillingness and incapacity to implement the instruction given to them. So the question is, do we live in a society where the electorate can instruct their elected representatives? And let's not forget, they were asked for the instruction by the members of Parliament who passed the EU Referendum Act. Can they issue a binding instruction to the political establishment or not? Okay. That's what's at stake in holding a second referendum.
Denis? But this is forgive me, this is silly. In 2015, the British people gave an instruction to a majority of Tory MPs by electing them to form a government. And then 2 years later, arbitrarily, Mrs May decided to have another election, a second vote, and the British people took away that majority. And so I fully accept, and I've never argued against the right of people to vote in the plebiscite 30 months ago, but the demography's changed. An awful lot of the very nice people who voted for Brexit in their older years have now gone to the great Brexit in the sky. And there's a lot of younger people, about 1.5 million, who've come onto the electoral register. Only 37% of the total British electorate voted to leave the EU. There's no other country in the world where a little more than a third of the electorate can take such a monumental constitutional decision. It's not the politicians who've messed up. It's business who are on their knees saying, look, we're going to have to move out of Britain. We're already moving out of Britain. You apply your Brexit, Mrs May's Brexit, almost any kind of Brexit, that is Britain becoming a substantially poorer, weaker country. Okay. I mean, Lee may wish that on the next generation. I've got 4 children who are young adults. I don't wish it on them. Okay. And the great Brexit in the sky, that's the greatest euphemism for death I've ever heard. I want to put that on my tombstone. Simon Usherwood, before we let you go, a second vote, a people's vote, would that help or harm the situation?
Well, I think what you're seeing here is, you know, the greatness of democracy. And also the problem with democracy, it's right and proper that people are involved in the decision-making of a country's affairs. The problem is how you involve people and when you involve them can be done in a number of different ways. And I think both Denis and Lee are highlighting two different models. And it's not that one has to be right and one has to be wrong. It's that both of them have their adherents. The issue here is at the moment that to get to a second referendum, you also have to have an agreement by Parliament that is what they're going to do. And we don't have a majority for that at the moment in Parliament. We don't have a majority for leaving without a deal, for Theresa May's deal. And unless and until somebody changes their mind or accepts that their view is not going to be the one that prevails, you're going to find that this impasse and blockage is going to continue.
Interestingly put. Well, we're going to say goodbye to Simon Usherwood now. Thanks a lot, Simon, and welcome in political analyst Klaus Jurgen from Vienna. Klaus, help me understand especially what the Germans are thinking. I know you're in Vienna right now, but in Germany, the most powerful EU nation, what are they thinking about the chaos across the continent in the UK?
Well, good afternoon, first of all. Actually, I wanted to start by saying I should have put on a black tie because I think it's a very sad day, but that would be a kind of cynical comment. Now, I think it is fair to say that there is a public sentiment, including a sentiment in the political classes of we don't understand you anymore. First of all, you are voting for a Brexit. You would have known that in order to guarantee a soft, or ideally no, as today, border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, at some stage you will have to come to either staying in the customs union, parts of the single market, or doing a free trade agreement. Or if all else fails, Northern Ireland would have some sort of special relationship. The Irish border issue was always hot on the agenda, but over time, during the past 24 months, almost sidelined. Now, leaving this aside, what Germany would not understand is the following. A prime minister manages to hammer out a deal, a 585 pages strong withdrawal agreement, which up to a certain extent allows both the UK and including Northern Ireland and the European Union to walk away and say, look, we sorted out this mess. Now, as it seems, some are very unhappy in the United Kingdom about this. Labour always said we are unhappy. And now late last night and early this morning, the British Conservative Party has got nothing better to do, 48 signatures, to ask for a vote of no confidence. Honestly, if I would be a voter in the United Kingdom, I would not understand the government. I would not understand what had happened to Brexit, and I would simply probably turn away from politics altogether.
Lee Jones, the Europeans are also confused, and usually the longer a story endures, the clearer it becomes. With this one, it becomes, I guess, foggier and more muddled. Do the Europeans have good cause to be completely befuddled by what's going on in the UK right now?
Yeah, I think to an extent. I mean, the British government did not work out a negotiating position before it triggered Article 50 and began the negotiations. And that was a fatal mistake because the Leave campaign was really dreadful and didn't set out a clear vision for Brexit or post-Brexit Britain. And so that had to be developed, really, through political discussion. That was Parliament's job. But too many people in Parliament fell about in hysterics trying to thwart the referendum outcome. And so the government felt pressured to invoke Article 50 immediately. And then what happened then was very EU. The negotiations started. They were secretive, highly technical and highly bureaucratic. And after 2 years, the government comes back and presents a Brexit deal to the public and expects people to accept it and to try to bounce Parliament into accepting it.
Denis
That is
Macshane.
the way that EU negotiations work. And it's hardly any surprise at the end of all this, when there was no consensus to begin with, that it is now contested. But the problem is this contestation is coming far too late in the day to have any impact.
Come in, Denis.
Well, very simply, it's really, Lee, that's not quite accurate. For the sake of our Turkish listeners, I think we have to stick to the facts. The decision was taken in June 2016. Mrs. May made a sequence of speeches announcing what she wanted. They were very, very far-end UKIP type of insult saying that people who believed in the European Union were citizens of nowhere, no deal was better than a bad deal, and Brexit means Brexit. Then finally, 9 months later, end of March 2017, she sends in the letter starting the negotiations. That's why we're leaving 2 years afterwards on the 29th of March. But and then she pulls a general election. She had a working majority, and she thinks she's going to win a lot more support because she thinks the country's moved massively to the right in the direction of Rupert Murdoch and all the anti-Europeans. And blow me down, she loses 30 seats, loses her majority, and becomes dependent on a very obscure, extreme Protestant bunch of MPs representing about 30% of the population in Northern Ireland. Hence all the trouble with Northern Ireland. The negotiated withdrawal agreement is fairly sort of sensible. It's 3 very small issues. The rest of it is going to be what I call a Brexiternity. That's the title of my next book. A Brexiternity of negotiations going into the 2020s on every single issue, from freedom of movement to how much lamb meat can be sold, quotas of apples and cheeses, and so on. It's going to be poisonous and painful. It's going to divide the country again and again. And meanwhile, I was in Tokyo 3 weeks ago. The Japanese investors who brought our car industry back to life are saying, look, we're fed up with you children. You want to go back to the 19th century and you still think you're running an empire. We're off and out of it. Britain will suffer.
Klaus Jurgen, I know there is an almost existential fear from many in the UK, those who voted for Brexit and those who were Remainers, that whatever happens in the coming months, a lot of people feel perhaps Britain's going to be left less well off than it is right now. And I don't ask you to speak on behalf of the entire European continent here, but is there a feeling in the corridors of power in Europe that Europe's also going to be less well off without Britain at this stage?
Absolutely. It is not only the United Kingdom losing out, it is definitely the European Union losing out. Think about one of its key member states with economic might, with global reputation, with a strong international influence, not only within the European Union, but still it is, call it a brand, call it a trademark. No one talks about the empire anymore, but modern Britain is a trademark, a brand. Now, the European Union losing this will have to reconsider, where do we actually want to go? What kind of common house Europe do we have? Only recently, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron raised this issue of a European army, and I labeled it, maybe this is a kind of post-Brexit trial to see how else can we form this European house much closer. The EU will lose a lot of international clout, and they are always worried there could be a second exit. Now, how to avoid a second exit, if it would ever be on the cards, make sure the European voters do not think that Brussels has sold out to London. Hence this enormous, sometimes bizarre bickering about this and that and quotas and here. But ultimately they did hammer out a deal, 585 pages long. Now it is assumed perhaps Theresa May this weekend will get another 4 or 5 pages of explanatory remarks she hopefully puts in front of the United Kingdom Parliament before January the 21st. But yes, the UK is losing out. It sounds so easy, it is so simple, but what London probably did not understand correctly in 2016, the EU will move on. Global politics will move on. There are many challenges from security, cybersecurity, trade, world, global politics, and the United Kingdom will somehow no longer be part of this common European approach. Fair enough, if that's what they wanted. But how could London hammer out its own global position? They might become a trading giant, yes, but what about the rest of politics? Will the people be happy? And the European Union will lose out greatly. Yes, there was always the bickering, do we want to ban prawn-flavored crisps in the United Kingdom, which was even used by some of the pre-Brexit campaigners to say the European Union wants to destroy our way of British life. Honestly, most people never took that very seriously, but it is still used up until today. Luckily, we got rid of all this regulations coming from Brussels. What they didn't understand is there is much more serious stuff. And I think step by step it is triggering in. If you watch news coverage from outside Parliament the last couple of days, you always see demonstrations, manifestations in London. The people are fed up, to say it very modestly, with all my admiration for the United Kingdom.
Okay, well, all eyes are still on March 29th, 2019, but there's a lot going to happen. Until then, it's never boring and always chaotic. Unfortunately, I guess. Klaus, Lee, and Denis, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.